Welcome to this presentation related to Lesson 2. In this lesson, we will talk about the origin of projects and project selection. It will be the same presentation like we had in the Zoom session, but now you can review the text without any interruptions when students ask questions. Anyway, it will give you a nice overview of the topics that we will be covering in Lesson 2. Let's have a look at the content of the lesson. First of all, we look at the origin of projects. Where do projects come from? It's very important to understand where these different projects come from. I remember my course with AT&T, and the people always said, there is a project, and it just was there. It came created by the gods, I don't know. There was a project, but nobody said, where do these projects come from? And it's important to understand, where do we find the projects? How do we get them? We also look at the company strategy, the portfolio, programs and projects, because a company, for growing, to create growth, to continue evolving, developing new services and new products, it is important that the company has a strategy. They can have a long-term and a short-term strategy, and based on the financial means, they will define portfolios, programs and projects. We'll look at that in one of the slides. One of the elements to evaluate projects is based on financial principles and financial parameters for project evaluation. We want to make a profit. We want to see that those projects that we select, that they are compliant with our expectations. Elements that are very important to define projects relate to the business case, the statement of work and the feasibility study, and we'll be looking into these different elements where we can find the elements, where we have the information, what is typical for a business case, what's typical for a statement of work, and what is a feasibility study. The last element we will be discussing in this lesson is about the return on investment policy for project selection. We will create a kind of matrix that we will use to evaluate projects and to evaluate them. Now, it's very important not just to select one project, but we will be looking at a portfolio, we'll be looking at programs, we will be looking at groups of projects, and what we want to do is to optimize the entire portfolio. It's not just about the project, but it's about all the elements that we are considering, and that makes it rather complicated when we are looking at those evaluations. Now, in the part of this course, I just want to make you understand what are the principles. We are not going to go into the details because this becomes very complicated. For small companies, it can be easy, but for larger companies, this becomes really a very difficult exercise. The last thing in the course that you have to finish before you can continue to the next lesson is the discussion forum. You find the information on the e-learning platform, what is the topic to discuss about. And of course, we have also an end of lesson quiz. And there is some exercise that I provided you that you can use during the breakout sessions to talk with the people to see that you found the same information. And of course, in this presentation, we will also do some exercises. So that's the content. What are the learning outcomes for lesson 2? You will be able to describe where projects originate from. You can estimate the financial efficiency of projects. You can calculate different financial parameters like the return on investment, the payback time, net present value, and internal rate of return. Part of these things also relate to the time value of money. There are a lot of videos about that to understand how time and money relate, how we can calculate the future value of an investment. And of course, we also want to know the present value of future cash flows. We also look into the interpretation of the financial performance of the project, so you will be able to interpret it, of course, in a limited fashion, because in real life there may be more complex parameters to consider. You will also be able to evaluate project financial performance and define a return on investment policy for projects. Let's have a look at the origin of projects, and in the first slide we're looking at products and services. You know that products, services and results are in fact the outcomes of projects. We can create a product, we can create a service, but we also have the third category which relates to results. Let's have a first look at products and services. As a product, we can consider the development of a new car, for example, the Lexus case that we will discuss later in this course. It's a nice example on how a company developed a new product. We also can consider the development of new services, creating a new website, an application, other services that may be available, registration services. Today we have services for testing for COVID and all other possible services, travel services, anything that you can imagine. Now, when we look at product and service development, they are typically related to the company's strategic growth. A company wants to grow, has to create new products. For example, look at Apple. They're constantly creating new products. They're also providing services, Apple Music, Apple TV. So basically, these are things that are supporting the growth of the company. We also have some common elements related to products and services. They all have a budget, and what we expect, what we hope, is that the project, once it's completed, that it will generate positive cash flows, and basically that it will generate a profit and a yield as determined in the company. Now, for a profit, it's quite simple. A profit means that we have to have a value larger than zero. We will express that later, for example, with the parameter of net present value, but I will discuss that later in this presentation. The yield is a little bit more difficult because you have to understand that a company has to pay to use money. There is a kind of interest they have to pay. It's like when you get a loan from the bank. When you take a loan from the bank and you pay 5% interest and you create a project, well, it's very important that the yield of your project is at least equal to those 5%, and it better should be higher. So the yield has to be defined or determined by the company, by the CFO. We have to say this is the yield that we have to obtain, but we also have to calculate the yield based on the initial investment and the future cash flows. Let's look at some more elements related to products and services. We can also consider a project to create a product or a service for an external customer. So we are a company, we're providing certain services. We can develop products for somebody, we can develop services like websites. So basically we have a contract with the company and we are in fact creating the product or the service for that external customer. Now, an external customer can be a customer within our own organization, a large organization, but of a different department. For example, we may be making internally a website for different departments when we have a specific department that does it, and we will provide that service for an external customer, which in this case is somebody from another department. Now, basically, when we do this, we have to have a contractual agreement between the company or the department developing the product or service and the customer for whom we are creating this product. Different types of contracts exist, and the final cost of the product or service will be used by the customer to evaluate profits and yield. So basically, when we make a deal, we have a certain cost that we charge, we invoice the customer, and that's the initial investment that the customer uses, and they will use that initial investment to evaluate their profit and the yield of the investment. So based on that information, the company doing the project, on the other hand, has to optimize the performance to guarantee the estimated profit. So when we in AT&T were selling a wide area network to different customers, we had internal cost factors. We could determine how much a certain service would cost. We have let's say a profit level, and we could work with that profit level or future agreement, for example, the duration of the contract where we have monthly payments by the customer. We could evolve what's the performance, not only related to the project, but also to the life cycle of the project. On the other hand, the customer would be using our elements, our cost, to verify their profit and their yield. When we look at results, it's a little bit different here. A result typically relates to improvements. And these improvements will not create cash flows. So we are doing something that has to be improved. And typically here we have to consider this as a saving. So a negative cash flow or reducing the negative cash flow. We're reducing the cost, which basically is an extra income. So we're going to use the savings as the parameter to evaluate the efficiency of the project. Now we can have projects related to environmental issues. We have to update parts of the factory at a certain moment. A lot of companies were in fact looking at making, let's say, the service of cleaning the water. You can do that in a different way. You can pay very high costs, but you could do it yourself. You can have a company providing the service to clean it. You can make your own system to clean. We can look at process improvements. So we see that we have, for example, setup times of parts of the processes, the bottlenecks, typically a problem in operations management, where we want to switch very quickly between different products to create, and we have to reduce that setup time, because during the setup time, the process stops and we lose let's say, a lot of money. It can go into the thousands of euros, 10,000s of euros per hour or per minute even, depending on the processes that we have. So we can make very impressive savings there. I have some very interesting examples. For example, the first one is Hewlett and Packard in Czech Republic, where we were visiting. They were using a lot of hardware to install in their devices. Now, that's all okay. When you have a hard disk, you buy that hard disk. Perhaps you did it, perhaps not. It depends. If you try to make your own computer or whatever you do, let's say that hard disk, it's packed in an individual box. It contains a lot of paper, plastic. It takes a lot of time to open, to make it ready for use. So basically what they considered, they said, we are using thousands of these hard disks. Now, 5 minutes on one hard disk to prepare it is not a lot, but if you have 5,000 minutes, you're talking about different orders of magnitude. And when they started looking at the improvements here, they could reduce the, let's say, non-value add time. Unpacking the hard disk is non-value added. You don't have add any value to it. You're just making it ready for production. Also, the packaging was done differently. So they created a box with all the hard disks in there, of course, separated from each other with special plastic, a special foil, anti-static plastic. And all these things created a very important saving. Another element I just mentioned before is reduction of setup time in processes. They call it SMET. It was invented by Toyota, single minute exchange of die. When you see the cars, the car production, they start with steel, rolls of steel, from which they make the metal parts. And that's done in a die. It's a very heavy press. And changing the parts in that press is in fact very difficult to do. Took a lot of time, which made it very difficult to change between types, and you try to reduce the work in progress when you are having a lean operation. And they found a way that they could do the changes in less than 10 minutes, single minute exchange of die. So a lot of processes have been adjusted just to see that you can do those changes more efficiently and have a more flexible production. To do that, you have to make a small project, you have to start dealing with it, you have some time that you invest, you have to do the work, and you can calculate very quickly how much money you are saving. So a lot of interesting things about products, services, and results. But let's have a look at the company strategy. First of all, we have the company strategy as it is. We have, from the company strategy, we need a budget, we need those investments, and with that investments, we have the possibility to create a portfolio. The portfolio for the entire organization, and we can find sub-portfolios, which are in fact the portfolios for the different departments, and every department drills down, translates the company strategy in their specific strategy. So those sub-portfolios can be for research and development, for marketing, for operations, and so on. And they come all together in the portfolio related to the company or the organization. There can be programs composed of different projects in the main portfolio, but we can also find individual projects. All of them are there to create benefits that support the company strategy and that create the means to make the company grow. And that's very important, to have an optimal selection of that portfolio, an optimal investment, an optimal use of your financial resources, and of course also use of your human and material resources. Another thing which is very important to consider when we look at projects is the effect of cash flows. When we want to finish a project, we need money, and once that project has been completed within the budget, hopefully, we expect cash flows, positive cash flows, after the completion of the project. Now, it can be that in the beginning it takes a little bit more time before we get positive cash flows. In the startup, it depends on the type of organization, type of product or service that we are using. But typically, we expect to receive positive cash flows that will compensate for the investment. So basically, we have project, an investment, and then we see future cash flows. And based on that, those elements, we have to, or we can determine the financial performance of the project. And we can make different estimations, and we have to consider different possibilities. Different parameters will be used, and we will be looking at some examples later on. Some examples you already may have seen in the different videos that were posted on the e-learning system. Now, when we provide a project, let's say for an internal and external customer, we do not necessarily see the cash flows, but payments for deliverable services, and we have to see that we compensate the costs and realize the project or the profit as projected. So when we are providing that project, we finish the project, we finish it, so we give it to a customer. In our project case, we have to evaluate what is the cost that we have, what is the profit, and we have to evaluate. We don't see once the product has been sold, it's gone, depending on the contract. Some contracts we still have some service levels or service agreements, it depends. But basically our project is finished and we evaluate it like that. We don't have those cash flows at the end, but we may have prepayments, partially payments of the work done. And what we have to evaluate is how efficient are we, in fact, in completing the work. Because if we have problems with executing some tasks, they take longer or there are problems, it means that we are spending more money than originally planned and our profit level will go down. And that's not really good. We don't really want to have this. Now, when we look at savings, it's a different element. When we looked at the projects where we have a service and we realize those savings, and those savings should compensate the investment. Now, when we look at savings, it's sometimes very difficult to say what are the savings. We put an element there. We have to find a way to estimate it. For example, we have a new system. It will help us that the average time to answer a call is reduced, and we have to find a way how to calculate it. How do we express customer satisfaction? How do we calculate the reduced time to resolve problems? Of course, we can say when we have a problem, we have so much time to do it in normal circumstances. After doing the project, we will do it faster. So we can say that is the cost, that is the new cost, and we have a saving. Some of these things may be very difficult to estimate, like customer satisfaction and so on. Now, let's say we have to look at setup time, quality improvement. These are a little bit easier to evaluate, let's say by evaluating the time savings that we have, the reduction of rework, the faster payments by the customer. That could also be a very important parameter, because the faster a customer pays, the faster we have in fact our money back and we have a better cash flow. Our cost of capital, well, we don't have to wait, we have the money faster, so it's an important saving. Financial project, financial performance can be estimated based on the initial investment and the expected savings over time. Now, when we look at the project cash flows and savings, here below we have some cash flows. I selected the project, a simple project where we have an investment of 500,000 euro, dollar, whatever. I put a minus sign because it's a negative value, it's a payment. And we see in year 1 we get 75,000, year 2 150,000, year 3 200,000, year 4 250,000, year 5 200,000, and year 6 175,000. Now what we see here in the second row is a simple calculation. So we have the initial investment of 500,000. We receive in the year 1 75,000, so we're still 425,000 in the red. The next year we have an income of 150,000, which reduces the loss to 275,000. 200,000, we go to 75,000, and then we see that we have positive values. Now here we calculate with not discounted values. These are the real cash flow, how we estimated them. But what we see at the end of year 3, we're still in the red, but somewhere in the middle of year 4, after a few months, we will see that we start going into the positive. Now, these elements we have to understand. We have the investment, the estimation of how much the project will cost. That's the first element. And then we have those cash flows. Those cash flows in the value of the year that we expect them. So that was the first part of this lesson. In the next video, we'll continue with the second part.